Hello everyone. In this session, we are going to discuss networking in AWS. So here we are going to discuss what is the basic concept of networking. Then we will discuss difference between public and private networking resources. And then what is a VPC? So let's understand VPC. So AWS will offer networking services also. So like Amazon VPC. VPC stands for Virtual Private Cloud. So you can create separate private network also in AWS cloud using the VPC service. So what is a VPC? We can say. So VPC is a networking service that you allow to use stabilized boundary around your AWS resources. In very simple terms, try to understand what is a VPC. Suppose guys, this is your AWS cloud. In this AWS cloud, yes, no, in this AWS cloud, we want to create one separate portion, isolated section. In that section, you are allowed to host your resources only. Isolated section means creating a separate network. So I am going to create one separate network. How you can create separate network? One private network using the VPC service. So AWS will offer one service that is called as a VPC, Virtual Private Cloud. Using that service, you can create a separate network in the AWS cloud. You can easily understand in this way. Suppose there is a hotel. In the hotel, suppose thousands of rooms. So hotel just like one cloud, public cloud. So anyone can go to hotel, anyone can use the hotel. But suppose, but you have take a one room as a rent. So it means you have created one private place within a hotel. In that place, only you can place your resources. You can use. No one can other use. So this is a private section. We can say this is a private area for you within a hotel. Similar here in AWS cloud, if you want to create one isolated section where you can place, you can allocate your resources that you can do using the VPC. So for that, AWS offer one service that is called as the VPC service. So it means you can create one private network. Private network is nothing as is a list of a range of IP addresses. So you have allocated some range of IP addresses. So within this IP addresses, yes, no, whatever resources is lying, only those resources you can access within IP addresses. It means you are lying, you can access. No one can access from outside. So Amazon VPC, yes, no, stand for Virtual Private Cloud. So it means private network to deploy your resources. So Amazon VPC enables you to provision one isolated section of the AWS cloud. And in this isolated section, you can launch resources in a virtual network that you have defined. This means you can define own virtual network within a AWS cloud. Within a virtual network, within a virtual private cloud, you can organize your resources into subnet. Okay, what is a subnet? Let's understand. So first of all, let's understand what is a VPC. So VPC is a service which is allowed to create one isolated section within a AWS. So suppose this is your AWS. If you want to create one isolated section, so you can create isolated section, yes, no, using the VPC service. So we have created one isolated section. Within this isolated section, so VPC is allowed to create one virtual network. And now this virtual network, you can divide several sub-networks. When you divided this network into sub-network, that is called as a subnet. So here you can check it. We have created, yes, no, a subnet. We have created subnet. That is called as a subnet. So subnet is nothing. Subnet we can say is a part of your network. Is a subnetwork we can call as a. So whatever isolated area network you have created, further you can divide that isolated network into subnetwork, where each subnetwork you can call as a subnet. That is called as a subnet. So subnet is nothing. We can say subnet is a section of your VPC that contains resources such as Amazon EC2 instance, whatever resources you have created. Okay, whatever resources you want to create, you can create those resources. Let's check this diagram. So what is a subnet, guys? Subnet is allowed to you portion your network inside your VPC. This means suppose within an AWS, we have created one isolated section. Now you can divide this isolated section into multiple partition, where each partition you can call as a subnet. So subnet is nothing, is a section of your VPC in which you can group resources based on security or operational needs. Subnet can be public or private. So what is a public subnet? Public subnet is a subnet that can be accessible from the internet, and public subnet contain the resources that needs to be accessible by the publicly, and private subnet is the subnet that not accessible from outside, from the internet we can't access. So what is a private subnet? Private subnet is a subnet that is not accessible from the internet. So private subnet contain the resources that should be accessible only through your private network, such as database that contain customer personal information, the order histories. Okay, so what is a VPC? Very simple term. VPC is a service that will offer by the AWS to create one private network in AWS. So within a AWS, guys, you can create one isolated section, and now this isolated section you can create using VPC. It means you can create own VPC, and now within an isolated section you can divide further this isolated section into subnetwork that is called as a subnet, and that subnet may be public or private subnet. Public subnet means nothing. It means in that network where you want to allow outside traffic. So you can suppose you have created one isolated section. Further, you are dividing that isolated section in some section that is called as a subnet. And one subnet you can make as a public, one subnet you can make, other subnet you can make as a private. Public subnet, that is a subnet in which outside traffic is allowed. And private subnet is that where outside traffic is not allowed. Any resources, yes, no, within your network that is needs to be accessible from the internet, those resources you can launch in your public subnet within your VPC, and the resources which are secure that are not required to accessible from the internet, those resources you can launch in private subnet within your VPC. You can check this diagram. In this diagram, yes, no, we have created one VPC. Within a VPC, yes, no, VPC we have further divided into subnet. We have one public subnet and private subnet. So within a VPC, yes, no, we have public subnet, private subnet, and public subnet is that subnet that can be accessible from the internet. It means any resources that you have required to access, yes, no, from your VPC outside the network. So those resources, yes, no, you can launch in your public subnet, and in private subnet you can launch those resources that is not needs to be accessible from the internet. That is called as a subnet. So here, while you learning the VPC, important point, remember this point. First, we need to understand what is a VPC, and then we need to understand what is a subnet. So there are several terminology we will use, but first of all, there are main two terminology we need to understand: what is a VPC and what is a subnet. So very simple term you can remember. VPC is nothing. VPC is a service that will offer by the AWS to create on virtual private network in AWS. You can create separate private network in AWS, and subnet is nothing. You can say that private network you can divide further into subnetwork that is called as a subnet. So I hope it's clear what is a VPC and what is a subnet. Thank you.